Hello, everyone. I've heard that you don't have enough top 10 lists for the year of books. I've heard that there's a shortage of videos like these, so I've decided to fill that, meet demand, and as always, we are going to rank the 10 favorite books that I read in 2023. Okay, so this year I've got a lot of really good books again. I will say this is a distinctly less stacked year than the last two. I am still doing one per author. Unlike the last 2 years, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Last 2 years, if I hadn't done one per author, it would have been dominated just by like one person. This one, it only affects one author who would have been on here multiple times, and they only would have been on here twice, I think. Maybe 3 times. Probably twice. So it wouldn't have made that much of a difference, and I'd just be talking about the same thing twice. So I'll mention them when they come up. So without further ado, let's get into it. Still a lot of really excellent books. Even if I read less this year. I'm washed up. I'm past my prime. I'm sorry. My brain, it doesn't work as well as it used to. It's very sad. But I still read a lot of really good books and pretty varied books. So let's get into it. So, coming in the number 10 spot, we have one of the books that's made me just on the faithful adaptation train again. We have a book that really is a weird reading experience, and that is No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. And what makes this weird is it's written incredibly sparsely with weird mixes of super descriptive writing. But for the most part, it will just be then he walked in the store, he opened the door, he closed the door. And when I read an individual page, I'm like, this is written really weirdly. But while I was reading it, it just had such a rhythm to it. It was encapsulating. And also just it had this weird thing where when I read individual pages, I'd be like, okay, this is super inefficient at communicating the story. But then the entire book in its entirety is incredibly efficient in how much it gets done in a pretty short amount of pages. It's about 300 pages with reasonably big font. I don't know the word count. And I just really enjoyed it. If you've seen the movie, the movie is almost an exact scene by scene adaptation. This, I believe, was originally written as a screenplay. So of all the books to be adapted, this was probably able to be adapted the most directly. It doesn't have dialogue tags. It for the dialogue, it's just sentences. It was he'll just write sentence, enter, no period, no punctuation. It worked though. I knew who was talking. The dialogue was very distinctive. Just very much gave off the vibe of real people talking. Super suspenseful, very fast paced, and just really well constructed. And I just enjoyed reading it. Even though the conclusion was very abrupt. It was obviously intended to be abrupt, but I enjoyed it quite a bit. And so it was my 10th favorite book that I read this year, not including rereads, one per author, whatever. So next up is a book that was a follow-up of what originally was considered a complete series. And it's a follow-up that the author, I think, said everything in this was already in the series. And it felt like a waste of time. But I gotta say, reading it, I'd heard that before I went into it. So I was expecting to revisit things that were already in the series. And this would be the equivalent of if you read Two Towers and it was there's no reason to. I guess if you read up to the final book of Lord of the Rings, you read up to book 5, Pelennor Fields, and Tolkien was there's no need to put in book 6. Everything is already there. And then you read book 6 and it's just all new stuff. Anyway, it's Earth of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which allegedly is all already in Book of the New Sun. What? Anyway, this did a fantastic job of before reading it, I was didn't know that I needed it. And now it's it felt like such a natural continuation. It felt like it was the end that was always intended, even though I just factually know it wasn't the end that was always intended and was a later creation. Just incredible creativity. The creativity of the world building and how insane it is crazy. The writing is extremely good. Severian is a fascinating character. I still don't necessarily get super, like, emotionally engaged when reading Gene Wolfe. Like, I don't necessarily see, like, the people as people, but everything about the setting and story is just so unique and interesting, and the way it's presented is unique and interesting, so it gets the number 9 spot on this. So, for number 7, we actually have another incredibly creative, incredibly unique novel that's really unlike anything I've read before. I would actually argue that the start of this novel is more confusing than the start of Book of the New Sun. I had no goddamn clue what was going on, but it did the trick. It split into, I guess, like 6 parts, where, like, each part kept getting better. I don't know if I like it. There's, like, the prelude and is one of the parts, and then 5 days. And I don't know if I like the 5th day more than the 4th day, but I definitely like the 4th day more than I like the 3rd day. I definitely like the 3rd day more than I like the 2nd day, and I definitely like the 2nd day more than I like the 1st day. I definitely like the 1st day more than I like the, what did they call it? Anyways, the book is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez, which is one of the most gorgeous books. Like, this is just the standard run-of-the-mill hardcover. Good work, Del Rey. Like, it's got interior art as well. That's, like, pretty damn cool. It's just before the 1st day, the 2nd day, the 3rd day, the 4th day, the 5th day after. So I guess there's 7. Anyway, this just kept getting better as I read it, basically. At one point, I was worried I was going to be enemies with Evie. I might still be enemies with Evie. I struggled, like, for the first 50 pages or so. I was like, what is going on? And not the what is going on and, like, I'm enjoying myself, I just don't have context. Like, what is the story I'm being told? I was not smart enough for the start of this book. But then it really clicked together. This is like, it's got frame narrative, in frame narrative, in frame narrative. And my favorite is by far, like, the deepest. So what I mean by the deepest is, like, everyone knows King Killer. You've got Koth writing down the thing and, like, the story in a story. So the deeper layer of the story is, like, the story Koth is telling. And then when there's a story in that story, that's, like, an even deeper layer. So, like, the one that got the most time, the equivalent of, like, the story that Koth is telling, that was my favorite by far. This is one of those where I personally, I might have enjoyed it more if it was, like, just that story, but it was so bold and, like, just such a bold choice to do it like that. And I know probably for the people who are the mega fans, one of the reasons they're mega fans is the story within story. So it's hard for me to be like, I think it should have been like that. Like, no, I think it should have been the way it was. And that was clearly what the author wanted to do. And it's clearly why it's some people's, like, favorite books ever. But I was largely confused by some of the frame narratives. That being said, the main narrative I thought was just straightforwardly excellent. Incredibly, like, creative world building while also being reasonably detailed. Just really compelling characters, well paced, epic and heartfelt. Like, it was just a good book. Just a good book. And the prose, I would say at times, like, borders on purple. It's very, like, it's a huge part of the style. It's very stylized, not purple. Purple's the wrong word. Purple, I think, is, like, inherently a criticism. It's a very stylized prose that might, like, that could be the reason you like it even more than me. It also could be a reason to, like, not like it at all. But yeah, it was an excellent book. And it's also just, like, it looks so nice. Like, it's such a nice hardcover. Okay, coming in on number 10, 9, 8, 7. I think I said 7 for Spear Cuts Through Water. Spear Cuts Through Water was 8. Coming in at 7, we have a new release, which was my favorite new release of the year. But I only read, like, 3 new releases this year. And one of them was a novella that came right before the main novel new release. So that doesn't mean that. No, wait, I guess I read 4 new releases by the same person. This is one of them. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. No points for originality with this pick. I continue to really like Brandon Sanderson. To me, he's one of the, just, like, when I read his stories, they're extremely immersive. Like, very much like I open the page and the world blurs into the background and I'm experiencing the story. I think in general, the Secret Projects let him really get creative with his world building. And this is, like, in my opinion, an extremely creative world that I really enjoyed. I thought it was very well paced. And it was a proper Sanderlanche. Reveals that I thought were fantastically done. Interesting main characters. I mean, I don't have that much original to say. Some people may not like the narration. It's narrated by a known Cosmere character. I really like that narration. I also really like that this is narrated as if it's told to someone who lives on Roshar, as far as I can tell. So the narrator will will explain things as if he's explaining to someone who's just lived on Roshar. So will sometimes not explain things based on, and sometimes will explain things, and I think it was just a really interesting way of doing it, and an interesting frame narrative. And also, again, this book is gorgeous, probably the best art. I mean, all the art there for a lot of the secret projects was really good. This is maybe my favorite, and I like the part where they balance the rocks. So for the number 6 spot, I'd like to give a shout out to my mom, who recommended this book, who read all of Realm of the Elderlings and was like, hey, maybe you should read some of my favorite books. And I was like, well, that seems reasonable. And the one I read first was I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb, which is a long book. The pages are very thin. It's 885 pages. It's probably longer than most of the Realm of the Elderlings books. I thought it was excellent. This is about someone whose twin brother, identical twin brother, gets schizophrenia, and how this has kind of upended his life. And I'm not gonna lie, this protagonist, he kind of sucks. You get to watch him make disastrous decisions that tend to be quite compelling and heartfelt. And I thought the character work was really well done. I thought everyone in the novel was very compelling. It was a really, I think, multifaceted protagonist who had a very good character arc. It's not generally setting-wise, I don't think it's as interesting as the spaceship in Earth of the New Sun, but whatever. I thought it was very well written and just competent. Good job. Lots of very flawed, multifaceted characters that I thought came to the new ending. And actually, I will die on this hill. This is a fantasy novel. There is in the flashback that's I know this much is true. That if you've read the book, I don't know if you remember, there's a rabbit that something happens with that rabbit that's magical, folks. This is a fantasy novel, and it's a good fantasy novel. It's amazing how many of the contemporary novels throw in an element of fantasy, because they know it makes it better. Genre is just staying winning. Moving on. So we're into the top 5. And this one is actually not a fantasy novel. This is a historical fiction novel. For a non-fantasy novel, this just had everything that I like. So, things I like. Ancient Rome. I like Ancient Rome. I like epistolary novels. There's Piranesi, love it. There's a random epistolary chapter in Senlin, love it. I just love that. I love the journal entries. Really efficient, well-done characters that are not given a lot of time. Yeah, that's my jam. Prose that is really well done and beautiful while not being dense. That's me. That's exactly my favorite type of writing. What has all of these things? Augustus by John Williams has all of these things. It's just letters. It's actually not journals, sorry. The entire book is just letters between people, and it's 300 pages. And by the end, I felt I knew some of the characters better than I know in multi-thousand page fantasy epics. Just extremely well done. I love the time period. All 3 parts were excellent. I liked each part more. I think it's 3 parts. I read this near the beginning of the year, so I'm probably forgetting some things about it. But it does have the downside of when you get all letters. When you get there's just some letters that aren't super interesting, but most of them were extremely compelling. And so it was one of my favorite books of the year, and would be one of my favorite non-fantasy books, or non-fantasy or sci-fi books. But especially since I Know This Much Is True is a fantasy book, but also I like Augustus more, so that doesn't actually make a difference. But so many books are have fantasy. The craziest argument I've ever had on the internet. No, that's not true. That's a high bar. I once argued with someone who was trying to tell me The Stand wasn't a fantasy novel, and I'm like, the antagonist is a wizard, dude. Anyway, that's a tangent. This book is actually not a fantasy book. All the other ones on here. Oh, No Country for Old Men. I don't think it has any fantasy in it either. Anyway, whatever. This one, historical fiction, it's fantastic. So, for the second straight year in about this area of the top 10, we have a mostly sci-fi short story collection. And once again, it's excellent. And I don't know which I like more, the one from this year or last year. But this is the most well-known work from one of my favorite authors that I hadn't read. And that's The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu. And to express how good this is, I think I'm just going to read the preface. Because this preface, like the preface slaps. That's how good Ken Liu is. Multiple times reading this book, I just stopped and was like, Ken is so good at this. Like, he's so good. No, we're not going to read the preface. That's a waste of time. So this was an extremely consistent short story collection. I liked all of them. There's one that I've seen some people not like as much. It might be like my second least favorite, but I still think it was really good. The standouts, if I look at the list, this is like 13 short story collections, so they're pretty short. The standouts were The Paper Menagerie, which, funnily enough, I think conceptually was like not one of the most unique. It was just so well executed, and like everyone who reads it cries, because yes, if you want to know if you can cry when reading a short story, go read The Paper Menagerie. The Man Who Ended History, a documentary, was one of the longest ones. Thematically brilliant, incredibly compelling, incredibly unique. I loved Mono No Aware. I don't see this as high for other people. Dual Timelines, thought it was brilliant, incredible ending. The Perfect Match is one of my favorite dystopian short stories. It's one of the reasons is a lot of the time, like when you read the dystopias, like it's hard to picture yourself as the complacent person in the dystopia. Like we always like to think that we'd be the person who sees through the BS. In Perfect Match, I'm like, I wouldn't see through this BS. I'd be one of the people like being like thinking everything is fine. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of really good ones in this short story collection. Most of them are excellent, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to read a short story collection. Ken Liu is so good, man. Let me tell you a story. It's a story of a man who read the books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin and thought, like, yeah, these are really good. They didn't make, and none of them made my top book list of that year because it was 2021 and that list was stacked. But if I'd read them this year, Tomes of Asquan would have made the top 10 list. Really solid, quite liked it. Was like, I like Ursula K. Le Guin. She's a really good writer. Not one of my favorites, but very good. Then Jake read The Dispossessed. I liked The Wizard of Earthsea. I cannot express, like, 10 pages in, I was like, oh my god, I like that. Like, even just the writing style, I liked so much more. Like, I think The Dispossessed is brilliant. I think the main character, Shevek, is a fantastic protagonist who's complex, who's flawed, but is just compelling. And, like, the entire setting and idea is done so well. The premise is, like, you know how people say about Small Gods by Terry Pratchett that you could recommend it to someone, like, whether they're religious or not, and it's about, like, institutionalized religions? This feels like this. So it's set on, there's a planet that's all capitalism, and it's a moon that left a bunch ago who are doing the anarchism thing. And I think it's nuanced enough that I could recommend it to people, like, whatever their political opinions are, and if they're, like, a reasonable, well thought out person, they shouldn't get mad at it. Like, I will say, like, if I was gonna try and find a criticism for this, I think the necessity of it being a novel forces it to undercomplicate both. There's a lot of, like, physics. The main character is a physicist. To undercomplicate physics and also undercomplicate, like, how complex this economy, the moon economy, would have to be. But, like, that's not the point. So don't worry about it. It's fine. Just an incredibly compelling book that I loved from start to finish. Yeah. It was fantastic. Like, I loved it. It was excellent. 5 stars. Okay, only 2 remain. And also The Dispossessed, by the way, was a book club pick. And this next one is also a book club pick. So the book club is turning things around for 2023. I don't know if you remember my bottom 5 list for 2022. But there was a lot of me saying this was a book club pick. And The Children of Time was a book club pick. This was my first Tchaikovsky book. It will not be my last Tchaikovsky book. Unfortunately, in the process of moving, a car door was left open in the rain for 20 minutes, and this was in the seat. So I can't read. If I ever want to reread it, it's going to be interesting. This, man, even describing the premise is difficult because I actually don't want to, because like it does the escalation thing where like you're realizing what the story's about incredibly well. This is split. It's got spider chapters and it's got human chapters. It's primarily an arc ship story and also like an entire society creating itself. The amount of ideas it tackled through a spider society in a way that like isn't saying that this is analogous to human society and I'm saying this about the spiders, so I'm saying this about the humans because that would be dumb. But being able to like read and be like, oh, this is like, this raises questions about our society that I'd never, and like humanity that I'd never considered, because it's able to tackle them from like a completely different perspective that like we'd never consider from like the human perspective, is amazing. I really liked the human chapters. I thought it had really well fleshed out characters, was incredibly well paced, played the long game, and ended up with an incredible final act. So yeah, I forgot to be given scores. This was a 9.3 out of 10. Excellent, excellent, excellent book in my opinion. Very well written as well. Like the prose is, a lot of people have said this about Tchaikovsky. I'm not being original here, but it's kind of just the middle point between like very straightforward, where it's clearly more straightforward prose, but it's just elegant and it just works. Anyway, show of time. So every top 10 list needs an honorable mention section, or it's just incomplete. And I like to do my honorable mentions right before my book of the year. So that way you can be held in suspense on whether this book will make the top 10 if you're aware that I read it during the year. So I've just got a few honorable mentions. I did a lot of rereads this year. So like obviously if I counted rereads, like I read Lord of Emperors, Words of Radiance, and Ship of Magic last year, which for those of you who know me, that is like my... Well, two of those are in my top 4 books. I don't know if they're respectively 2, 3, or 4, and then one of them is like my 5th favorite book. So, those. But last year, I counted a reread in my top 10 list because my opinion had changed enough from the first one, and also I used the excuse that originally I read it as 3 books, Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return of the King, and this time I just read The Lord of the Rings, which is totally different. I'm not going to do that this year, but if I did, A Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin would have made the top 10. Like, I liked it enough. And I did like it. Like I last read it when I was 17, and I liked it quite a bit more this time. And it easily would have been in the top 10. It would have been in the like Paper Menagerie, Dispossessed, Children of Time group somewhere. I've got an entire spoiler stream about that with Kyle, where we go through the entire book. Also for honorable mentions, I've got Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Litzau, which I would just like to mention, I'd heard going into this book that it had egregious typos and as like a criticism of self-pub. Now, I think it's entirely possible that the people reading it read a different version of it. Like, I think there was a thing where the version that went out originally, like, some copies weren't the final edited version. I would just like to say, if that is holding you back from reading it, the version that I read, I didn't notice a single typo. I'm not saying there are 0 typos. I'm sure, like, there are lots of books that have a couple typos. But there's a small enough amount of typos that I noticed 0 typos. Usually I notice anywhere from, like, 0 to 4 typos in a book. I'm not great at noticing typos. But, like, if I noticed 3 typos, that probably means there were 10. Me noticing 0 typos probably means there were single-digit typos. I also thought it had an extremely well-done protagonist. It was just a really good book. Interesting world. Had a bunch of dream sections and made them not suck. There was also a bunch of conversation like that, stuff that was analogous to the American Dream. That part of it I thought was a little, like, thin, where people were being kind of repetitive and didn't really go, like, in any depth in a way that where I was like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. The main character of this also, like, the main character is dealing with depression. I believe that I like Kaladin more than I like Jesper as a character. But I think specifically in terms of the depiction of depression, this is an even better depiction than Kaladin. So if you love Kaladin specifically for that reason, I would recommend Dreams of the Dying. Has a long fallen action, good book. I have Warrior Born by Jim Butcher on here. It's a novella. It's super short. It was heaps of fun. It had talking cats. I don't think it had enough meat on it for me to put it on this list, but I really enjoyed it. And I have A Shadow in Summer by Daniel Abraham, the first book of the Long Price Quartet, which I know I need to continue. I have let people down. I will make it known right now on YouTube that I got a Kobo for Christmas, and the first book I downloaded was Betrayal in Winter. Like, it's the next book I'm starting. I will read the Long Price Quartet in 2024. And then I have a book that's the bind-up of both. I haven't been able to find Betrayal in Winter for a long time, and I want to read it on my phone. Like, every time I looked at a bookstore, I would check for Betrayal in Winter, and it always didn't have it. So I blame you, Alan. You got Betrayal in Winter sold out. But anyways, I'll just read it on the Kobo now. And then I have the bind-up of the last two. And yeah, also honorable mention to the book in the same trilogy that's number 1 that you'll find out what it is very shortly. So far I've done 3 top 10 videos. First one, book of the year, was The Gathering Storm by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. So let's say Brandon Sanderson has one book of the year. The next one, it was Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. So Robin Hobb has one book of the year. And last year it was Lord of Emperors by Guy Gavriel Kay. So those are like probably my 3 favorite authors, and they each have one book of the year. So that's fitting. So the tie has been broken. If you go to my Goodreads and all the books I have read, and you sort by the average Goodreads rating, this book is the lowest rated book on Goodreads that I've ever read, which also shows I don't read a ton of like super low rated books, but a bunch of like the lower ones I like. And with a 3.44 Goodreads rating, Forest Mage by Robin Hobb is my book of the year, giving Robin Hobb her second book of the year since I have started this channel. Now, granted, this would not have been the book of the year in my previous 3 years, but it is this year. So, Soldier Son trilogy. I didn't mention them in the honorable mentions. At least 2 of them would have made this top 10 list. I think maybe 3 of them. Yeah, actually, all 3 would have made this top 10 list if it wasn't one per author. So, Shaman's Crossing, I have a review for. Shaman's Crossing is a complete goddamn mess. Like, it's one of the worst paced novels that I've ever read. I'm someone who generally doesn't go like, this book is longer than it should have been. Shaman's Crossing is a lot longer than it should have been. Like, it's 800 pages. 400 of those were not important to Shaman, to the book, or the story as a whole. Like, even in hindsight, I'm not like, wow, none of this was really important. Okay, so I really liked it. That being said, also the protagonist is really unlikable, Nevere. He's like the person in D&D trying to play a laudful good character, but really just being a super self-righteous. Okay, so I really like Shaman's Crossing. I thought it was, like, I can't, it's hard to recommend, because it's such a mess in so many ways, but I just think the character relationships and supporting cast are, like, so incredibly well written. It's Robin Hobb. Like, she's my favorite character writer by so much. Like, every single, like, if you look at the web of relationships, they're just all compelling and complex and human enough to be the main relationship that an entire book is about. But there's like 12 of them that are that good. So I get why that book has a really low Goodreads rating. Shaman's Crossing, I think, is a mess. It's just a mess that I really like. Forest Mage, I think, is legitimately just excellent. So I think it makes people uncomfortable. The main character, as a very minor spoiler, no, I'm not even saying, the main character just, they have, I would say, a medical condition causing them to deal with something, and they then are getting, like, blamed for the effects of that medical condition. And, like, it's super uncomfortable to read at times. Like, it's painful. But it's painful in the well-written way, in that, because it's believable and, like, well done. Not as in, like, it's boring. And then I think it might be the best plotted Robin Hobb book. Like, it's complex in the way that, like, it's an incredibly complex plot, but not in, like, the contrived way. In the way where there's a bunch of characters involved, and they're all acting like people, and with their own motivations and their own thing going on. but like it's actually incredibly tight. Like it's an incredibly eventful and incredibly tight, and like the setup and payoff is so good, and it's an incredible ending, and the character work is incredible, and the world building is great. Like, get over it, people. Forest Mage, yeah, it's why it's my book of the year. And then Renegade Magic, I'll mention as well, is the final book, which makes a really bold narrative choice that I could see bothering people, because it forces the main character to, in some ways, be passive, and Navarre is already, like, the most indecisive person you've ever met. That's the main reason to not like the trilogy, I think, is if you just don't like Navarre. I like Navarre. Like, I like reading about Navarre, especially in this book. Yeah, love the trilogy. Strong 4 stars for the first book, 5, and then 9.4 for Forest Mage is my book of the year. Yeah, like I actually, the others I'm like, these are very flawed, but I really like them. This one, I'm just like, no, this is just really good. Like, yeah, there's parts of reading it that like, you know the episode of The Office, Scott's Tots, where like Michael Scott has told like an entire high school that he would pay for their college, and then he has to go tell them that he's not paying them. And you know how like difficult that is to watch? But like, not because it's bad, it's just like this, the secondhand like embarrassment of the main character makes it like hard to watch. That's the way in which this is uncomfortable to read it, but that was Michael's fault. Like, that was because Michael was an idiot. This is secondhand embarrassment, but like not actually not Navarre's fault. Him being blamed for something outside his control. And yet I think people still feel the secondhand of embarrassment because that's just like how humans work, and it's so well done. Excellent book. It's hard for me to recommend the Soldier Son trilogy, but if you're a big Realm of the Elderlings fan and you're scared by the Goodreads rating, don't. So that's my final top 10 book list for 2023. I don't know if I'm gonna do a bottom book list. I didn't read that many books. There's one that I do want to rant about. I read one book this year that I just think was pretty bad. Also, I just realized that the light in the back actually was way too bright, and I think turning it off makes the lighting look way better. So in the future, I'll have it off, and it won't be a thing. New background, by the way. Bookshelf. Look how nice they are. Yeah. Let me know what you think of this top 10 list. Have you read these? Are they on the TBR in the future? What do you think? Do you think I'm right about why people don't like Forest Mage? That it's just that aspect that makes people... If you've read it, and feel free to yell at me for not continuing the Long Price Quartet.